The night hung heavy over the plains of Wallachia, the air thick with a cold mist that drifted lazily across the landscape, carrying with it the unmistakable stench of old blood and decay. As a lone rider approached the outskirts of Targovist, he noticed the unnatural stillness that blanketed the land. No distant murmurs from guards, no faint chatter from villagers, not even the restless movement of nocturnal animals. There was only the rhythmic creaking of timber swaying gently in the wind, a sound that grew louder and more unsettling with every step his horse took. When the moon finally slipped out from behind the clouds, its pale light revealed a sight that froze the rider where he sat. An immense field stretching far beyond what the eye could comfortably take in, filled with countless bodies mounted on wooden stakes, towering like grotesque monuments to suffering. These figures, once soldiers, envoys, nobles, criminals, and unfortunate souls caught between politics and cruelty, were arranged with deliberate precision, creating the chilling impression of a vast, macabre forest sculpted entirely from human corpses. Some had clearly been dead for days or weeks, their forms shriveled and stiff, while others bore grim signs that life had only recently left them, their features twisted in silent agony. The horse beneath the rider refused to advance any further, trembling violently, as if every instinct in its body screamed to flee from the terror embedded in this cursed ground. Even an animal, unburdened by human reasoning, understood that this place was not merely a graveyard, it was a message. At the very center of this horrifying tableau stood a man whose posture radiated a calmness so unnatural it eclipsed the horror around him. His armor, tarnished and stained with dried blood, caught the faint glimmer of torchlight. His dark cloak drifted like a shadow behind him as he surveyed the stakes with the detached stare of someone observing a completed work of art. This was Vlad Dracula, voivode of Wallachia, a ruler whose name stirred equal parts reverence and dread across empires. Some saw him as a defender of his homeland, a prince who stood unyielding against corruption and invasion. Others believed him to be a creature of pure cruelty, a man who wielded terror with more precision than any sword. But in this moment, surrounded by the consequences of his choices, he stood as something far more complex. A leader convinced that fear was the most reliable form of power, and that brutality was not an indulgence, but a necessity. History often immortalizes conquerors through their triumphs and glory, but Vlad's legacy is carved from a far darker material. His story is not one of military brilliance or political maneuvering. It is a chronicle of the sins he embraced, the sins that shaped him, and the sins that ultimately turned a mortal ruler into the infamous myth known across centuries. This is the beginning of his darkness. This is the sinful reign of Vlad Dracula. From the moment Vlad was old enough to understand the weight of his family name, the world around him made it painfully clear that the blood of a prince was both a blessing and a curse. Born into the noble house of Draculeshti, he entered a realm soaked in political betrayal, foreign domination, and internal treachery. Wallachia was not a kingdom. It was a battleground where loyalties shifted like sand, and leaders survived not because they were righteous, but because they were ruthless. And into this chaos stepped a boy who would eventually become one of history's most feared rulers. When Vlad was still a child, his father, Vlad II Dracula, made a fateful decision. Pressured by the rising power of the Ottoman Empire, he surrendered his two sons, Vlad and his younger brother Radu, as political hostages. The boys were taken deep into Ottoman territory, far from their homeland, and placed under the iron authority of the Sultan. There they lived in a strange duality. Treated as noble guests, yet constantly reminded that their lives were bargaining chips. Every lesson in diplomacy was overshadowed by the implicit threat that misbehavior could mean punishment or execution. Inside these foreign walls, Vlad learned the truth of human nature in its darkest form. He saw prisoners tortured for information, soldiers whipped for minor disobedience, and nobles humiliated for political advantage. But he watched everything with a cold, unblinking focus. Where another child might have broken, Vlad adapted. He hardened, and while the Ottomans hoped to mold him into a compliant puppet, they only sharpened the edges of a growing fury. Meanwhile, in Wallachia, treachery unfolded without mercy. The boyars, Wallachian nobles notorious for their shifting loyalties, betrayed Vlad's father, murdering him and brutally torturing Vlad's older brother Mircea. The news reached Vlad in fragments, whispered by sympathetic servants and gloating rivals. He learned that his father had been strangled by those he trusted. He learned that his brother was buried alive. He learned that his family, his lineage, and his rightful place had been stolen by men who believed he would never return. And in that moment, the foundation of Vlad's future was forged. Revenge was no longer an idea. It was a duty, a purpose, a fire that would burn every corner of his life from that point onward. But while Vlad grew stronger in captivity, his younger brother Radu changed in a different direction. Radu, favored by the Sultan, embraced Ottoman culture, adopted their customs, and became known for his charm and diplomacy. Vlad, by contrast, resisted every attempt to reshape him. Where Radu softened, Vlad sharpened. Where Radu befriended, Vlad remembered. The brothers would eventually stand on opposite sides of a war, but that conflict, like many of Vlad's future sins, began here in a childhood stolen, a family slaughtered, and a homeland betrayed. By the time Vlad was finally released, he returned to Wallachia, not as a displaced prince, but as a young man carved from trauma. The sins that would define his rule, the brutality, the paranoia, the unrelenting violence, did not originate from madness. They were born from the belief that only through fear could he reclaim everything that was taken from him. And his revenge was only just the beginning. If there is one act that forever fused Vlad Dracula's name with terror, it is the gruesome and methodically engineered punishment that his enemies would come to dread more than death itself, impalement. And while the practice existed long before Vlad was born, he elevated it to a terrifying art form, transforming it into a tool of political messaging, psychological warfare, and absolute control. To understand why impalement became his signature, one must understand the mind of a man returning to a homeland that had betrayed his father, butchered his brother, and sold its loyalty to whoever paid highest. Wallachia was a land fractured by noble families who changed allegiances as easily as they changed clothes, and Vlad knew that reclaiming his throne required more than mere military strength. It required fear so profound that rebellion would suffocate in the hearts of men before it ever took shape. Impalement, horrific as it was, became the foundation of that strategy. Victims were not killed quickly. Vlad insisted on a method that prolonged suffering to the absolute limit of human endurance. A thick wooden stake, carefully rounded and greased, was inserted through the body to avoid piercing vital organs, allowing the victim to remain alive for hours or even days as gravity slowly dragged them downward. Their agony was not an unfortunate byproduct. It was the point. The prolonged suffering served as a public demonstration of what awaited anyone who dared to defy the prince's authority. Entire towns were forced to watch the slow descent of the condemned, their screams drifting across the fields like warnings carried on the wind. Children, nobles, merchants, envoys. Vlad believed that terror did not discriminate, and therefore neither could punishment. In his worldview, fear was the great equalizer. Foreign ambassadors sent from the Holy Roman Empire wrote accounts describing fields of impaled victims stretching as far as the eye could see. Ottoman chroniclers, no strangers to brutality themselves, spoke of Vlad's punishments with a mixture of horror and grudging respect. In one famous instance, when Ottoman envoys failed to remove their turbans in his presence, a sign of disrespect, Vlad ordered their head coverings nailed directly into their skulls, ensuring they would never forget their manners in the afterlife. But the most infamous manifestation of this sin came during the 1462 conflict with Sultan Mehmed II. As the Sultan and his vast army moved deeper into Wallachia, they encountered an enormous field of impaled bodies, 20,000 souls, arranged with terrifying precision. The sheer sight of it reportedly caused even hardened soldiers to recoil. Some historians claim that the spectacle shook Mehmed himself, forcing him to reconsider the wisdom of continuing deeper into the land ruled by such a man. For Vlad, this was the ultimate triumph. An army halted not by swords or fortresses, but by the overwhelming psychological power of horror. To him, impalement was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was a language, one that every rival, traitor, and invader could understand without translation. In Vlad's mind, the stake was the foundation of order, and without it, Wallachia would collapse into the chaos that had taken everything from him in his youth. Yet the sin of impalement carried a cost. While it secured obedience in the short term, it also cemented Vlad's reputation as something other than human. The more he relied on terror, the more he drifted from the realm of men and stepped into the realm of monsters. And with each body raised on a stake, his transformation drew closer to the legend that would define him forever. When Vlad Dracula reclaimed the throne of Wallachia, he did so with the understanding that traditional rule, built on diplomacy, negotiation, and shared power, was a luxury his fractured principality could not afford. In a land riddled with disloyalty, competing noble families and foreign empires constantly clawing for influence, Vlad believed that kindness bred weakness, and weakness invited destruction. So he forged a different path, one where order was not requested, but carved into the minds of his people through relentless, unmistakable displays of force. For Vlad, terror was not merely a tactic, it was governance. From the moment he took power, he sought to eradicate the chaotic corruption that had long plagued Wallachia. Theft, bribery, and betrayal had become nearly institutionalized, with nobles exploiting peasants and peasants in turn exploiting one another. Vlad's response was immediate and absolute. He instituted a legal system where even the slightest infraction could lead to extreme punishment, and this unwavering enforcement produced results that astonished neighboring regions. Suddenly, merchants could travel safely. Caravans moved without fear of ambush, and crime plummeted to near zero. One legend tells of a golden cup left unattended in the center of the capital's main square, a tempting prize placed within reach of every villager, traveler, and beggar who passed by. Under ordinary circumstances, it would have vanished within minutes, but under Vlad's rule, the cup sat untouched for months. People admired it from a distance, but knew better than to lay a single finger on it, for they understood that the price of theft was not imprisonment, nor a fine, but a slow and public death. His strict governance extended far beyond common criminals. Vlad held the Wallachian boyars, the noble families responsible for countless betrayals, including the murder of his father, in deep contempt. He summoned them to grand feasts, with lavish displays of hospitality, only to unleash judgment the moment the wine cups were emptied. Some he executed outright, others he forced into grueling labor, marching them until their bodies collapsed from exhaustion. To Vlad, this was justice, the cleansing of a corrupted ruling class that had poisoned Wallachia for generations. But the true core of Vlad's governance was psychological. He understood that a ruler could not be everywhere at once, but fear could. Stories of his severity traveled faster than any messenger. Mothers whispered warnings to their children. Merchants repeated tales of executions in distant villages, Foreign diplomats carried rumors back to their homelands, where they grew into elaborate accounts of a mad prince drenched in blood. Whether these stories were true or exaggerated mattered little. Their power lay in the way they shaped perception. In Vlad's mind, terror created stability. Where other rulers relied on alliances or institutions to maintain control, he relied on the expectation, the certainty, that any defiance would be met with an uncompromising response. His subjects obeyed not because they loved him, but because the alternative was unthinkable. Yet, as discipline tightened and fear deepened, Vlad's governance walked the razor's edge between order and tyranny. The same terror that unified Wallachia began to hollow out the distinction between justice and cruelty. And though the principality grew stronger under his iron grip, the seeds of future rebellion quietly took root. For in a kingdom ruled by fear alone, loyalty can never truly flourish. Only silence. As Vlad Dracula's power grew and Wallachia steadied under his severe rule, a new and more insidious shadow began to take hold within him. One that emerged not from foreign invaders or rebellious nobles, but from the depths of his own mind. Paranoia, once a silent companion forged through childhood captivity and familial betrayal, slowly evolved into a dominant force that shaped every decision he made. It whispered to him in the quiet hours of the night, reminding him that all rulers fall, that trust is a luxury reserved fools, and that behind every smile might be the concealed blade of a traitor. Wallachia's history did little to ease these fears. The principality was notorious for its treacherous politics. Rulers rose and fell with dizzying frequency, toppled by boyars who pledged loyalty one day and plotted rebellion the next. Vlad had seen this firsthand in the fate of his father. He had witnessed how quickly alliances rotted, how swiftly nobles shifted allegiance when foreign gold was offered or when threats became too great to ignore. This environment hardened his belief that betrayal was not a possibility. It was an inevitability waiting for its moment. As a result, Vlad's judgments grew sharper, harsher, and increasingly preemptive. He scrutinized every action taken by his council, every hesitation in a nobleman's voice, every whisper exchanged among soldiers. Men who might have served faithfully for years found themselves suddenly accused of treason, dragged from their homes, and subjected to interrogation that ended either in execution or in exile. Loyalty, for Vlad, was not judged by past service, but by an impossible standard of absolute obedience, rooted in his own escalating suspicion. His most infamous act of paranoia involved the Wallachian boyars. Vlad believed with some justification that these nobles who had murdered his father and betrayed countless rulers before him would eventually turn against him as well. So he devised a chilling plan disguised as generosity. He summoned the nobles and their families to a grand Easter feast in the capital, offering them hospitality, music, and lavish spreads of food and wine. When the celebration reached its peak, Vlad abruptly accused them of treachery, recounting their past betrayals in vivid detail. Many were executed on the spot. Others, including the elderly and children, were marched to distant mountains and forced into backbreaking labor until their bodies failed. For Vlad, this was not cruelty, it was insurance. Yet paranoia is a hunger that only grows with feeding. The more Vlad acted to protect himself, the more he convinced himself that unseen enemies lurked around every corner. He fortified his palaces, rotated his personal guards, and moved frequently to avoid assassination. Even those closest to him were kept at a distance, their loyalty always under silent scrutiny. At times, he seemed almost to challenge his enemies to strike first, as though daring them to reveal themselves so he could respond with merciless precision. This deepening distrust had a corrosive effect. Advisors became frightened to speak honestly. Soldiers obeyed out of fear rather than respect, and the common people whispered that the prince saw demons where none existed. Wallachia grew tense, brittle and suffocating under the weight of his suspicion. For Vlad, paranoia was both shield and poison. It protected him from the fate that had destroyed his father. But it also isolated him, warping his judgment and pushing him toward decisions that would ultimately erode the foundation of his rule. The walls he built around himself kept assassins at bay, but they also kept loyalty, compassion, and stability from taking root. And in the end, the enemies he dreaded most were no longer the Ottomans or the boyars. They were the ones he created himself. As Vlad Dracula's reign progressed, his brutality became infamous across Europe and the Ottoman Empire, but what truly unsettled his enemies was not the bloodshed alone, it was his unsettling mastery of deception. While many rulers relied on armies, treaties, or wealth to maintain their power, Vlad wielded illusion, manipulation, and psychological warfare with the precision of a seasoned strategist. In his view, victory was not achieved solely through force. It was secured through the careful orchestration of lies that could reshape the perceptions of entire nations. From the earliest days of his rule, Vlad understood that in a world where Wallachia stood between two great powers, the Kingdom of Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, survival required more than strength. It required the ability to play both sides, to speak convincingly with a sword behind his back, and to present himself as whatever each rival needed to see. Sometimes that meant appearing loyal, even submissive. Sometimes it meant projecting defiance, so absolute it bordered on madness. What mattered was not truth, but the effect truth could create. One of the clearest examples of his deceptive brilliance came in his dealings with the Ottomans. Though he had spent much of his youth as their political hostage, his release did not inspire gratitude or allegiance. Instead, it taught him precisely how the empire thought, how its leaders operated, and how its armies moved. Using this knowledge, Vlad pretended to maintain diplomatic ties with Sultan Mehmed II, even paying tribute for a time to appear compliant. But behind the facade, he prepared for war, fortifying towns, drilling soldiers, and secretly negotiating with Hungary. The turning point arrived when Ottoman envoys visited Vlad to demand increased payments and the surrender of personal hostages. Outwardly, he greeted them with courtesy. Inwardly, he viewed their request as a confirmation of his deepest suspicion. The Sultan did not see him as an ally or a prince, only as a servant who had grown too bold. In an astonishing act of calculated defiance, Vlad accused the envoys of disrespect for refusing to remove their turbans, then ordered those turbans nailed directly into their skulls. The brutality was undeniable, but the message was sharper. He would not kneel again. Yet his most infamous deception unfolded during the night attack of 1462. Facing the overwhelming might of Mehmed's massive army, Vlad understood that a direct confrontation would end in defeat. Instead, he studied the Sultan's encampment, learned the guards' patterns, and devised a plan that blended stealth with unrestrained savagery. Under the cover of darkness, Vlad led a small force deep into the Ottoman camp with a singular goal to kill Mehmed himself. Though the assassination failed, the attack plunged the camp into chaos, convincing many that Vlad was capable of striking from nowhere at any moment. Panic spread like wildfire, and morale cracked long before the next battle began. But his betrayal was not reserved solely for foreign enemies. Within Wallachia, Vlad frequently manipulated nobles, merchants, and even loyal officers to test their reactions. By planting false information, staging fake rebellions, or feigning leniency only to withdraw it, he created a landscape where no one could be certain of his intentions. The uncertainty itself became his weapon. For Vlad, deception was more than a tactic. It was an extension of his rule. If fear controlled the body, then manipulation controlled the mind. And together they formed a dominion more powerful than any fortress or army. But every lie leaves a shadow, and with each deception he crafted, Vlad drew one step closer to becoming a figure, not merely feared, but deeply universally distrusted. As Vlad Dracula's reign unfolded, the boundaries between truth, rumor, and legend began to dissolve, weaving together into a single monstrous identity that neither he nor his enemies could fully control. The man who had grown from a hostage into a hardened ruler now found himself standing at a strange crossroads, where his cruelty, his reputation, and the fears of countless witnesses began shaping him into something larger and darker than any mortal prince. From the earliest years of his return to power, foreign travelers, merchants, diplomats, and spies carried stories of Vlad's actions far beyond the borders of Wallachia. Some accounts were grounded in truth. Others were embellished with the kind of theatrical horror that listeners could not resist repeating. Yet Vlad did nothing to deny these tales. In fact, he encouraged them, understanding that fear traveled faster and struck deeper than any army he could raise. What began as rumor quickly hardened into identity. Stories circulated across Europe of Vlad dining among impaled victims, calmly eating his meals while the dying moaned around him. There were whispers that he washed his hands in their blood, or that he consumed the flesh of his enemies. Chroniclers wrote of him drinking the blood of those he executed, an image that blended the horrors of war with the primal terror of something supernatural. Most of these stories were exaggerations, products of fearful imaginations or deliberate political propaganda. But as they spread, they shaped how the world saw him. And in time, they shaped how Vlad saw himself. For a ruler surrounded by enemies, whose legitimacy was always under threat, these stories became a form of armor. If the world believed him capable of atrocities beyond human comprehension, then perhaps fewer men would dare to challenge him. If enemies feared not just defeat, but a gruesome fate at his hands, then maybe Wallachia could remain free from foreign domination. In this way, Vlad discovered that a reputation for monstrousness could achieve what diplomacy and armies could not. But a reputation is a double-edged blade. As fear of Vlad spread, admiration and support dwindled. Allies grew cold, uncertain whether they were dealing with a prince fighting for his homeland or a tyrant consumed by madness. Even those who benefited from his restoration of order whispered behind closed doors, terrified that his suspicion might one day turn toward them. His people obeyed him, but few loved him, and fewer still trusted him. Meanwhile, his brother Radu, once a fellow hostage in the Ottoman Empire, had become a beloved figure among the Ottomans, celebrated for his charm, diplomacy, and gentle nature. As Radu returned to Wallachia with Ottoman support, many nobles, exhausted by Vlad's harsh rule, defected to his side. Vlad's monstrous reputation, once his weapon, had begun to isolate him even from his own subjects. And yet, perhaps the most remarkable transformation occurred long after Vlad's death, as European writers of the 15th and 16th centuries seized upon his story to craft moral lessons, political propaganda, and sensational tales. German pamphleteers depicted him as a demonic figure who delighted in suffering. Transylvanian Saxons portrayed him as the embodiment of cruelty. These accounts, often exaggerated or invented outright, became the foundation for a legend that transcended history itself. Centuries later, Bram Stoker would draw from these dark tales to create his iconic vampire Count Dracula, a creature of the night who lived on blood and inspired terror across the world. While the fictional Dracula was not Vlad in any literal sense, the association became inseparable. The sins of Vlad the Impaler had carved such a deep mark in the collective imagination that even death could not free him from the monstrous identity that grew in his shadow. In the end, Vlad Dracula became something paradoxical, a man so feared, so mythologized, that his real deeds, brutal though they were, became dwarfed by the monstrous legend that rose beside them. He had set out to build a legacy of strength and vengeance, but the world instead remembered a creature of pure terror, This was his final sin, not the impalements, nor the betrayals, nor the relentless cruelty, but the surrender of his humanity to a legend he allowed to consume him. In the final years of his life, Vlad Dracula found himself surrounded not by loyal armies or fortified walls, but by the consequences of the very terror that had once secured his throne. Fear had been his greatest weapon, carving order into a land synonymous with betrayal, but it was also the force that isolated him, hollowing out the loyalty he desperately needed when the tides of power shifted against him. What he built through brutality began to crumble under the weight of that same brutality. When the Ottomans pressed deep into Wallachia and his brother Radu returned with vast foreign support, Vlad looked to the nobles and warriors he had ruled with an iron grip. He expected defiance, unity, perhaps even admiration for his fierce resistance against an empire that sought to swallow them whole. Instead, he found silence, cold, calculating silence, from men who feared him more than they feared the invaders. Many defected to Radu, preferring submission to a foreign-backed ruler over the unpredictable wrath of their own prince. Vlad fled into the mountains, keeping only a small retinue of loyalists, men who followed him not out of peace or prosperity, but because they believed in his unyielding refusal to kneel. But exile eroded what little security remained. With few allies and dwindling support, Vlad navigated a landscape where trust was impossible, and every shadow concealed a potential assassin. His paranoia, once a shield, became a prison, locking him into a spiral of suspicion that further alienated even those who remained faithful. Eventually, with the shifting politics of Eastern Europe, he managed to reclaim the Wallachian throne one final time, briefly, fiercely, and with the determination of a man who believed fate still owed him justice. But his last reign was short-lived. Betrayal closed in quickly, just as it had upon his father decades before. While riding through a forest near Bucharest, Vlad was ambushed by enemies. Some say the Ottomans, others claim Wallachian nobles who had feigned loyalty. The details remain obscured by history, but what is certain is that Vlad Dracula died as he lived. Surrounded by treachery, his decapitated head was sent to the Sultan in Constantinople, preserved in honey as proof that the terror of Wallachia had finally fallen. Yet even in death, Vlad defied oblivion. His body vanished into legend, his burial place disputed, and his legacy twisted into a labyrinth of myth and fear. For many in his homeland, he remained a protector, a ruthless defender who fought for sovereignty against impossible odds. For others, he became the embodiment of cruelty, a figure who crossed the line between man and monster long before his final breath. Centuries later, as stories of his impalements and brutal governance drifted into the imaginations of European writers, Vlad's legacy transformed yet again. He emerged not merely as a tyrant or a national hero, but as the foundation for the fictional Count Dracula, a creation that immortalized him in a form more terrifying and enduring than any chronicler of his own time could have imagined. This was the ultimate price of his sins. Vlad Dracula sought control, vengeance, and strength, but in pursuing these, he forged a legend that eclipsed anything he ever intended. His humanity was swallowed by the fear he cultivated, and the world remembers him not as the man he was, but as the monster he became. In the end, Vlad did achieve immortality, just not the kind any ruler would wish for.